The room was filled with the low murmur of whispers as the judge's gavel echoed through the courthouse. Tension hung heavy in the air, the kind that made the heart race and the skin prickle. It wasn't an unusual scene. Courtrooms were filled with the usual suspects, lawyers, defendants, families, and the occasional onlooker. But today was different. Something about this case felt like it was going to turn heads. Inside the courtroom, Officer Mark Harper stood tall, his uniform crisp and his stance rigid. He had a reputation of being a good cop, of following the law, of doing things by the book. But there was an unspoken truth about him, too, one that most people knew but never dared to speak. Harper's temperament could be volatile, and his prejudices ran deep, hidden beneath the facade of his badge. On this particular day, he was here to testify as a witness in a case that involved the alleged misconduct of one of his fellow officers. The defendant was a black woman named Alexis Carter. She had been arrested months ago on charges that were questionable at best, an alleged altercation with the police during a protest. She was strong-willed and outspoken, someone who had grown up in a rough neighborhood and fought hard for her place in the world. Alexis had never been the kind of woman to back down from a fight. She had seen the worst of the world, but refused to let it break her spirit. Yet, despite her resilience, the last few months had been a battle, both physically and emotionally. She had been treated unfairly, her voice suppressed, and the system that was supposed to protect her had only tried to bury her. The courtroom had taken a noticeable shift as Alexis walked in. Her presence demanded attention, even if her stature was not imposing. It was the way she carried herself, her head held high, her eyes scanning the room with the sharp focus of someone who had learned to survive against all odds. Harper's gaze fell on her as she entered, and a sneer tugged at the corner of his mouth. He had always thought that people like her, people from neighborhoods like hers, had no place in his world. To him, they were troublemakers, agitators. He had never been one to question his own biases. They were part of who he was, as ingrained in him as the badge he wore on his chest. But today his world was about to change. As the trial proceeded, Harper took the stand, his confidence unwavering. He spoke in a controlled tone, detailing what he had witnessed the night of Alexis's arrest. His words were carefully chosen, designed to paint her in a negative light. Every detail was made to seem more incriminating than it really was, and it was clear to anyone watching that Harper was more concerned with defending his own reputation than seeking justice. But Alexis was ready. She sat across from him, her face calm, her eyes unyielding. She wasn't there to shout or cause a scene. No, Alexis had something more powerful than anger at her disposal. She had the truth. As the questioning began, Alexis's lawyer pressed Harper on the inconsistencies in his story. With every question, Harper's confidence began to waver. He wasn't as solid as he had hoped to appear, and the cracks in his testimony began to show. It was obvious to anyone paying attention that his version of events was skewed, exaggerated to fit a narrative that he was more than willing to endorse. And then it happened. In the middle of the cross-examination, something shifted in the room. A man entered quietly through the door at the back of the courtroom. He wasn't dressed in a suit like the rest of the observers. His clothes were simple, casual even, but there was something about him that demanded respect. He walked with a purposeful stride, his eyes scanning the room as if he knew exactly where he was headed. As he made his way toward the front, Alexis's gaze flickered toward him. For a brief moment, she seemed to recognize him. But it wasn't until he was standing beside her that the full weight of the situation hit. Harper's face drained of color. His confidence shattered like glass. The man standing next to Alexis wasn't just anyone. He was someone that Harper had known for years, someone whose reputation was untouchable. The man was none other than Malcolm Carter, Alexis's father. Malcolm Carter was a former high-ranking officer in the very same police department that Harper worked for. He had retired early, but not before building a reputation that few dared challenge. Malcolm was known not just for his skill as a lawman, but for his unflinching commitment to justice and integrity. But it wasn't just his professional accomplishments that made him a force to be reckoned with. It was his personal history, the battles he fought against corruption within the system, his outspoken criticism of racism in the department, and his role in pushing for reforms. Harper knew the name well. In fact, there were whispers in the department about how Malcolm had been one of the few to call out officers like Harper for their prejudice and misconduct. He had been a thorn in the side of many, and it seemed that Harper was no exception. The realization hit Harper hard. He had just spent the last hour attempting to discredit Alexis. But standing before him now was the man who had helped shape her character, the very same man who had fought battles against the kind of injustice Harper represented. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Harper's composure faltered. His mouth went dry. His hands began to tremble ever so slightly. The room had gone deathly quiet, and all eyes were on him. There was no denying it now. He had just tried to destroy the reputation of a woman who was more than capable of fighting back, not because of the lies he had told, but because of who her father was. Alexis stood with her head held high, her expression unwavering. She hadn't flinched. She knew that this moment was coming. Her father's influence had been the quiet strength behind her every move. The love and wisdom he had imparted to her throughout her life had prepared her for moments like this. But it wasn't just her father's legacy she was standing on. It was her own. Harper swallowed hard, his mind racing. This was no longer just about him and his prejudices. This was about legacy, about accountability. The whole room could feel the shift, the unspoken tension as the walls began to close in around him. Alexis's lawyer, sensing the change in the atmosphere, pressed harder. "Officer Harper," he said with calm precision, "you've been quick to pass judgment on Ms. Carter, but now we know who her father is. How does that change the lens through which you view this case?" The question hung in the air like a sword ready to fall. Harper's eyes flicked nervously between the lawyer and the elder Carter, who stood confidently beside his daughter, unmoved by the sudden attention. The truth was undeniable now. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, but finally, Harper spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know," he stammered. "I didn't know who she was." It was the first honest thing he had said all day. And in that one moment, everything changed. The court could feel the power shift, like the weight of the truth pressing down on Harper. His credibility was gone, and so was the illusion of control he had so carefully crafted. The rest of the trial unfolded quickly after that. With Harper's testimony no longer considered reliable, the defense pressed forward, unraveling the lies one by one. By the end of the day, the judge had no choice but to drop the charges against Alexis. As Alexis and her father walked out of the courtroom together, they exchanged a silent look of understanding. This wasn't just a victory for them. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that failed to see their worth. The story of that day would spread through the community like wildfire. It wasn't just about a man's fall from grace. It was about a woman's strength, the courage to stand against oppression, and the unbreakable bond between a father and daughter who had spent their lives fighting for justice. And for Officer Mark Harper, the lesson was clear. No matter how deep the prejudices ran, there was always someone who would rise above them. Someone who would stand tall, unshaken, and unbroken. The story didn't end that day in the courtroom. While Alexis had won a crucial battle, the war, if it could be called that, was far from over. As the weeks passed, word of Alexis's victory spread like wildfire. For many, it was a symbol of resilience. For others, it was a reminder of the change that had to come. The power dynamics in the police department began to shift subtly, but undeniably. What had once been an institution that turned a blind eye to its own flaws was starting to feel the pressure of the very people it was meant to protect. Alexis found herself at the center of it all. In the months following the trial, she became an unexpected figurehead in the fight for justice and police reform. Her voice, once silenced by the system, now carried weight. People sought her out for advice, for support, for inspiration. She was everywhere, on the news, at protests, and in community meetings. But Alexis wasn't someone who sought fame. She wanted change. Real, tangible change. Despite the public outpouring of support, Alexis's life was far from easy. The media coverage was intense, and while many saw her as a hero, there were others who were determined to tear her down. There were whispers, threats, and smear campaigns, People who didn't want to see the system changed, who were threatened by someone who was speaking truth to power. But Alexis had been through too much to let these obstacles stop her now. She had learned how to handle adversity, how to stand tall in the face of danger. She was no stranger to being underestimated, and she knew how to use that to her advantage. The pressure only fueled her fire. Malcolm, on the other hand, had his own path to follow. After his retirement, he had remained a quiet force in the background, but now he found himself being called upon more often than he had ever expected. His name was brought up in every conversation about reform. His wisdom, his experience, and his unyielding commitment to justice made him an invaluable voice. Still, he never sought the limelight. Instead, he focused on the quiet work, mentoring young officers, organizing discussions on integrity, and exposing the corruption that still lurked in the department. His actions were not without consequence, and there were times when he feared for his own safety. But his resolve remained unshaken. One afternoon, as Alexis and Malcolm sat on the porch of their family home, overlooking the neighborhood that had raised them both, they talked about the future. "Dad," Alexis began, her voice soft but steady, "do you think things will really change?" Malcolm glanced at her, a thoughtful look on his face. Change doesn't come easy. It's never been about making noise for the sake of noise. It's about making a difference. Every victory, every conversation, every person we reach, it matters. Even if it feels like we're not getting anywhere, we're planting seeds. Change doesn't happen overnight, but that doesn't mean it isn't happening. Alexis nodded, absorbing his words. She knew he was right. She had seen the impact of their efforts, small victories that, when pieced together, began to form a larger picture. But there was still work to be done. As the months turned into years, Alexis continued to fight. She became a fixture in the community, a voice that couldn't be ignored. She worked tirelessly to support families like hers, families that had been overlooked, ignored, and harmed by a system that was supposed to protect them. She built coalitions with local organizations, brought awareness to the injustices faced by Black communities, and advocated for reform within the police force. Malcolm, though less public, remained a guiding force in her life. He knew the importance of showing the younger generation the way forward, teaching them to fight for what was right while remaining grounded in integrity. His legacy was not just in his work as an officer, but in the way he raised Alexis, a woman who was becoming an unstoppable force for change. And then, one day, the unthinkable happened. Alexis received a call from a local news station. A new piece of legislation had passed, one that would radically overhaul the police department's approach to accountability, transparency, and bias training. The bill had been in the works for years, but it was finally gaining traction, and it had been directly influenced by the public outcry sparked by Alexis's case and the push for reform that she had led. It was a bittersweet victory. She knew there were still many miles to go, but this was a sign that things could and would change. Her victory in that courtroom had sparked something bigger than just one case. It had become a movement. Her phone rang again, and this time it was from a politician she had been working closely with on the bill. "Alexis," the voice on the other end said, "we're going to need you to speak at the rally tomorrow. You've been the face of this change, and your words will inspire others to keep pushing." Alexis paused for a moment, thinking about how far she had come from that courtroom, about the man who had tried to discredit her, about the family that had supported her, about the many faces of people who had stood beside her through it all. The woman who had walked into that courtroom, full of uncertainty, was now someone who could stand before thousands and speak with conviction. "I'll be there," Alexis said, her voice steady. "And this time, I'll speak not just for me, but for everyone who's been left behind, for everyone who's ever had to fight for their voice to be heard." The next day, as she stood before the crowd, Alexis felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt before. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a beacon of hope, a symbol of everything that was possible when people refused to be silenced. The story that had begun in that courtroom had blossomed into something much greater. It wasn't just about one person's fight. It was about the collective struggle for justice, for equality, for a future where the system served everyone, not just the powerful. It was a story that was far from over. The story of Alexis and Malcolm didn't stop at the rally. While their victory was celebrated as a turning point, it became clear that the fight for justice was ongoing. For Alexis, this new phase was both exhilarating and exhausting. Her role as a public figure in the movement had put her in the spotlight, but it also made her a target. She received threats, faced public scrutiny, and was often forced to navigate the complicated world of politics and public opinion. Yet, every challenge she faced only strengthened her resolve. With her father by her side, they continued to push forward. Malcolm had always taught her to keep her focus on the long game, and Alexis had embraced that mentality with unwavering dedication. She knew that real, lasting change would not come from one speech or one bill. It was a continual process, a series of steps that required patience, persistence, and an unshakable belief in the power of the people. As Alexis's influence grew, she found herself at the forefront of reform efforts not just in her city, but on a national scale. She was invited to speak at national conferences, sit on advisory boards, and consult with lawmakers. Her name became synonymous with change, and the media, once critical of her, now sought her out for her insights and opinions. But even as her professional life flourished, Alexis felt the weight of it all. She had spent so much of her energy fighting for others, pushing for a better future, that she had neglected her own personal life. Her relationships with old friends and family members had become strained. She was consumed by the work, unable to find the time to simply be present for the people she loved. Malcolm noticed the toll it was taking on her. He had always been proud of her, but as his daughter grew more powerful, he saw the strain in her eyes. One evening, after a long day of meetings, he called her into his office. "Alexis, we need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious. She sat down across from him, exhausted but attentive. "What's going on, Dad?" He studied her for a moment before speaking. "I've watched you fight for years, but I've also watched you lose yourself in it. You're so busy trying to fix the world that you're forgetting to take care of yourself." Alexis sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know, Dad. It's just there's so much at stake. So many people depending on me." Malcolm leaned forward, his tone softening. "I know, sweetheart, but if you don't take a step back now and then, you'll burn out. And the world won't be better without you. You need to find balance." Her eyes met his, and she saw the concern in his gaze. It wasn't the first time he had tried to talk to her about this, but it was the first time she really heard it. The next few days were a turning point for Alexis. She took some much-needed time off, something she hadn't done in years. She spent time reflecting, reconnecting with her roots, and rediscovering the simple joys of life. She reconnected with old friends who reminded her of the woman she was before all the headlines, before the rallies, before the endless meetings. She remembered who she was, beyond the symbol she had become. At the same time, the reforms Alexis had worked so hard for were beginning to take root. The police department had implemented bias training programs, new policies for accountability had been adopted, and there was a new culture of transparency slowly beginning to take shape. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but progress was happening. As Alexis began to find balance in her life, Malcolm found himself thinking about the next generation. His work had been important, but he knew that Alexis was just the beginning. The real change would come from the young people who were now following in her footsteps. He began to mentor them, just as he had mentored Alexis, teaching them the lessons of integrity, justice, and resilience. One day, as Alexis walked through a community center in her neighborhood, she was approached by a young woman who looked at her with wide eyes. "Alexis Carter?" the woman asked. "You're the reason I'm here. You gave me the courage to speak out, to demand what's right." The words hit Alexis hard. She hadn't realized how many lives she had touched, how many young people had seen her as a beacon of hope. The next generation was watching, learning, and taking the torch. The future was theirs to shape, and Alexis was proud to know that she had played a role in it. As the years went by, Alexis continued to lead the fight for justice, but she did so with a new sense of purpose. She learned to balance the weight of the world with the importance of self-care. She never lost sight of the bigger picture, but she also made sure to stay grounded in the people who had always supported her. Malcolm, 2. Continued to fight for change, quietly working behind the scenes, ensuring that the lessons of the past weren't forgotten. He knew that true justice was not just about policies or laws. It was about the values that guided them. Together, they had created a legacy not just of reform, but of hope, resilience, and the unwavering belief that one person could change the world. And as they looked out at the next generation, they knew the fight wasn't over. It would never be over, because as long as injustice existed, there would always be people like Alexis, like Malcolm, who would rise to meet it. And the story, like the fight for justice, continued on. Months after the reforms began to take effect, Alexis started receiving invitations to national summits on police reform. These events were grueling, often filled with politicians and activists with differing views. But Alexis found her voice growing stronger with each new challenge. She became a regular guest on talk shows, contributing to panels, and speaking on national platforms about the importance of continued accountability in law enforcement. Her message was consistent. Change required more than just new policies. It required a fundamental shift in how law enforcement viewed the communities they were meant to protect. She talked about the need for officers to be trained not just in law, but in empathy and understanding to bridge the gap that had existed for so long. Despite the media attention, Alexis had never been more cautious. She'd learned to carefully navigate public relations, never allowing herself to be co-opted by any one agenda or person. The movement, she knew, was too important to let it be hijacked by politics. She made it clear that she didn't want fame or personal gain. She wanted to see real, lasting change. In the quiet moments, however, Alexis struggled with something deeper than the political and social issues she dealt with daily. She still felt the weight of that moment in the courtroom, the way her body had been handled with such aggression, and how powerless she had felt. No matter how much progress had been made, it always came back to that feeling of being victimized. She could feel it in her bones, the anger that burned at the core of so many of the issues she was working to address. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling interview, Alexis sat in her office, staring out the window at the city skyline. Her phone buzzed with notifications, but she let them go unanswered. She needed space to breathe. As the clock ticked on, she remembered a conversation she'd had with Malcolm months ago. He had told her that true strength came not from pushing through every obstacle, but from knowing when to pause, reflect, and regain her balance. But how could she pause when there was still so much work to do? Malcolm called her that evening. "Alexis, you've been pushing yourself too hard. It's time to take a step back. The movement will still be here when you come back to it. But you need to remember the person you are, not just the work you do." Alexis sighed. "I know, Dad. I'm just afraid that if I stop, I'll lose everything we've worked for." "You won't lose it," he said firmly. "In fact, you'll be better for it. Don't let the fight consume you. It's about balance. Do it for yourself, as much as you do it for others." The words resonated with Alexis in ways she didn't fully understand at the time. She decided to take a few days off, allowing herself to fully disconnect. She found herself traveling to a quiet cabin upstate, a place where she could think without the constant noise of the world around her. It was there, alone in the solitude, that Alexis truly began to heal. As she meditated on everything she had experienced, she realized something crucial. The fight for justice was never about her. It had always been bigger than her, about the future, about a legacy of equality, about the world that future generations would inherit. But in order to continue, she had to care for herself first. She couldn't pour from an empty cup. When she returned to the movement, Alexis did so with renewed energy and a clearer sense of purpose. She was no longer just a symbol of resistance. She was a leader with the strength to guide others. Her messages shifted, becoming more inclusive, reaching out not just to the oppressed, but also to the ones in power who needed to hear the truth. Soon after her return, she was approached by a new generation of leaders, young activists who had seen the change she had sparked. They were eager to build upon the foundation she had laid, and Alexis felt proud of them, proud that the future of the movement was in such capable hands. As she stood before a crowd of thousands one day, delivering a speech at another rally for police reform. Alexis could feel the overwhelming support of the community. She was no longer just fighting for her own healing. She was part of something much larger, something that would echo through history. With each word she spoke, she saw the faces of the next generation in the crowd, faces that were eager to carry the torch, to continue the work she had started. And in that moment, she knew this was only the beginning. The change they had all fought for was coming, but it was going to take time, persistence, and a commitment to something much greater than any individual. The fight for justice would never truly end, but Alexis had found peace in knowing that she had helped to lead the way forward. Her story was far from over, but it was no longer about one woman's battle. It was about the collective power of a people determined to create a future free from inequality. And that future, Alexis believed, was finally within reach. As Alexis and the team worked tirelessly to maintain momentum, it became evident that the fight for justice was far from over. While significant reforms had been implemented, deep-rooted systemic issues still loomed. Alexis knew that progress wasn't a straight path. It was a continuous cycle of small victories followed by setbacks, but each step was building towards something greater. In the midst of this ongoing struggle, she found solace in the support of her community. She often visited local community centers and schools, engaging with young people who were hungry for change. One afternoon, during a youth empowerment event, Alexis found herself in conversation with a group of teenagers who had become passionate about social justice. They were inspired by her journey, by the way she had overcome personal hardships to fight for a cause much larger than herself. One young woman, Jasmine, stood out to Alexis. She was articulate, confident, and full of fire. Jasmine shared how she had started a grassroots movement at her high school to raise awareness about racial inequality in the school system. She spoke of the challenges she faced in rallying her peers, some of whom had never encountered racism firsthand and were hesitant to acknowledge the issues in their community. "You know, Miss Carter," Jasmine said, her eyes bright with determination, "I didn't know if I could make a difference. But seeing what you've done, how you never gave up, it made me realize that it doesn't matter how small the fight seems. Every effort counts." Alexis listened intently, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. It was moments like these, conversations with the next generation, that made the grueling work worth it. They were not just inspired by her story. They were actively working to change their own communities, to create the world they wanted to see. Alexis saw herself in them. The same fire, the same hunger for justice. Later that evening, as Alexis reflected on the conversation, she thought back to her own early days in the movement. How many times had she doubted herself, wondering if the fight was too big, too impossible to win? But in those moments of doubt, she had found the courage to continue. Now, she realized, it wasn't just about leading, it was about empowering others to take the reins and carry the fight forward. The next step was clear. Alexis had to ensure that the next generation had the tools, the platform, and the resources to continue the work. She launched a nationwide initiative to support young activists, creating scholarships, mentorship programs, and training for those who were passionate about justice. She wanted to make sure that the work didn't stop with her, that the fight for a fairer, more equitable society would live on long after she had passed the torch. As she stood on stage at the unveiling of the new initiative, Alexis felt a sense of fulfillment that she hadn't experienced before. She had come a long way from that courtroom, from the woman who had been manhandled and underestimated. Now, she was a symbol of strength, of perseverance, and of hope. She had transformed her pain into power, her struggle into a movement. The crowd cheered as Alexis spoke, but in that moment, she was aware of something deeper. The work was never truly done. There would always be new challenges to face, new battles to fight, and new injustices to confront. But with each passing day, more people were joining the cause, more voices were rising to demand change. The movement was growing, and with it, the hope for a better future. In the final days of her speech, Alexis paused and looked out over the crowd. She thought of her father, of the lessons he had taught her, about resilience, about community, and about the importance of never giving up. And she knew that no matter what the future held, she had done everything she could to lay the foundation for a world where justice, equality, and love would one day prevail. The fight was far from over, but Alexis had found peace in knowing that the torch had been passed to capable hands. The next generation was ready, and with them, the promise of change was stronger than ever. Her story, like the movement itself, would never truly end. But in this moment, Alexis Carter knew that she had done her part, and that was enough. As Alexis continued her work, her influence grew beyond the borders of her city and state. Invitations to speak at international forums became regular, and her name was becoming synonymous with the fight for justice. Yet despite the recognition, Alexis remained grounded. She never let the accolades distract her from the mission at hand. During one of her international speaking tours, Alexis had the opportunity to visit a country that had been facing its own issues with police brutality and racial inequality. She was invited to speak at a global summit for civil rights, where activists from all over the world gathered to share their experiences and strategies. The conference was held in a large auditorium, filled with people whose stories mirrored her own, stories of pain, loss, but also of unwavering determination. It was a humbling experience for Alexis as she stood on stage looking out at a crowd that shared in the struggle for justice, each person carrying the weight of their own battles. After her speech, she was approached by a group of young activists from various countries. They spoke of their own challenges, how they faced resistance from their governments, how they had been harassed or silenced for their activism. But despite the obstacles, their resolve was unwavering. They wanted to continue the fight, but they needed more guidance, more support. "I've been in your shoes," Alexis told them, her voice steady but full of compassion. "It's tough. You'll face a lot of opposition, and it may feel like you're getting nowhere. But every day, every action you take, you're building something bigger. You're part of a movement that transcends borders. And trust me, change will come." The group nodded, taking her words to heart. Alexis felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was clear to her that the global fight for justice was interconnected. The struggles in one country were not isolated. They were part of a larger, worldwide movement. And the more she spoke with activists across the globe, the more she realized that the work she had started was just the beginning of a much larger revolution. She continued to share her story, to encourage and mentor those who were just starting their journey, offering the lessons she had learned from her own experiences. The international stage allowed her to form lasting alliances, to work collaboratively with others who shared her vision for a more just and equitable world. But even as she traveled the world, Alexis never forgot where it all started. She often returned to her community, to the people who had supported her from the beginning. She would visit local schools, community centers, and even just walk through the streets to connect with the people who had been her foundation. One day, as she walked down the street near her childhood home, a young girl approached her. She was no older than 10, her eyes wide with admiration. "Are you Alexis Carter?" the girl asked shyly. Alexis smiled, kneeling down to her level. "Yes, I am. And who are you?" "I'm Maya," the girl said. "I saw you on TV. My mom told me you helped make the world better for people like me." Alexis's heart swelled with emotion. "I didn't do it alone, Maya. We all have a part to play. But you can help too. Keep learning, keep standing up for what's right, and never forget that your voice matters." The girl nodded earnestly, as if she understood the weight of Alexis's words. Alexis stood up, watching as Maya ran back to her mother. In that moment, Alexis knew that the work was far from over. It would never be finished because there would always be new generations rising up to face the challenges of their time. But she also knew that, in a small way, she had helped plant the seeds for a brighter future. Every child who learned about her story, every young activist who carried the lessons she had passed down, was part of the ripple effect that would eventually transform the world. As she continued her travels and speeches, Alexis found herself increasingly focused on the long-term vision. She realized that the work of one person could spark change, but it was the collective effort of many that would sustain it. She couldn't do it all herself, But she didn't have to. The movement was alive, and it would carry on with or without her at the forefront. And so, as the years passed and Alexis's role evolved from activist to mentor and advisor, she could see the real impact of her efforts. The changes in the police force were more than just policy. They were a shift in culture. The next generation of officers was being trained with an emphasis on community engagement, empathy, and understanding. The legal system had been forced to evolve in ways that no one could have predicted. The fight was not just about laws, it was about human hearts and minds. And as Alexis looked toward the future, she realized that the work she had started was still in its infancy. The story of justice, of true equality, was still being written. But in this moment, she knew she had helped turn the page, and that was enough. As Alexis moved into the next phase of her life, she found herself reflecting on everything she had accomplished and everything that still needed to be done. The progress was undeniable, but the battles she had fought were not isolated to her city, her country, or even her generation. They were part of a global struggle, a fight that would stretch far beyond her lifetime. One day, while meeting with a group of prominent international activists in a city known for its history of social justice movements, Alexis found herself listening to a familiar call for change. This time, it came from a youth of the world. The gathering was a summit of young leaders from all corners of the globe who were fighting for racial equality, environmental justice, and the end of systemic oppression. There was an undeniable energy in the room. The young leaders spoke with passion about their visions for the future, their frustrations with the present, and their determination to create a world where freedom and equality were not ideals to strive for, but the foundation of society. Alexis took a deep breath as she stood to address them. The words that came to her were the same words she had spoken countless times before, yet they felt different now. She spoke of resilience, of the importance of community, and of the necessity to keep pushing forward even when the road seemed impossible. "You are the future," Alexis told them, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've seen so many young people stand up and demand change. And trust me, when I started this fight, I didn't know how we would win. But you've got something even more powerful than I ever had. You've got the strength of unity, the strength of a global community that is coming together for a cause greater than any one individual." The room fell silent as Alexis's words echoed in the hearts of everyone present. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped, as if the very weight of the movement was hanging in the air. "But remember this," she continued, "the work is not easy. It never will be, but it is worth it. The impact you have, the change you create, will ripple through generations. So don't ever stop. Don't ever believe that your fight is too small. Every effort matters. Every voice counts." The crowd erupted in applause, but Alexis knew that applause was not the reason she spoke. She wasn't speaking for recognition or for glory. She was speaking to make sure the fight carried on. As she returned home after the summit, Alexis felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had done her part, but more importantly, she had ignited a fire that would continue to burn long after her. The next generation of activists was ready, and they were armed with the knowledge, the courage, and the sense of justice that would propel the movement forward. In her own community, things were changing. The conversations had shifted. No longer were people afraid to talk about the systemic issues plaguing their lives. They were no longer silenced by fear or shame. The movement had given them a voice, and they were using it. Alexis began to take a step back from the daily grind of activism. She had built a foundation that would sustain itself, and now she wanted to spend more time with the people she loved, her family, her community. She was able to enjoy the quiet moments, knowing that the work was in capable hands. But even in these quieter moments, she remained vigilant. There was still work to be done, still battles to fight. The world was not yet perfect, and it never would be. Alexis had come to accept that. Change was a constant, a process that never fully arrived but was always evolving. As Alexis sat on her porch one evening, looking out over the horizon, she thought about all the lives she had touched and the lives that would touch the future. She smiled softly to herself, knowing that the fight for justice was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever stood up and said, "Enough." And with that thought, Alexis Carter, activist, leader, and mentor, could finally take a deep breath, content in the knowledge that she had played her part in the grand story of change. The future, for all its challenges, was brighter than ever before. The movement would live on. As Alexis settled into this new chapter of her life, the peaceful moments she had longed for began to feel more like a bittersweet pause. The world had shifted, but it was clear that the fight for justice was far from over. The generations that followed were carrying the torch forward, but new challenges arose every day. Alexis's own journey was a testament to the sacrifices and efforts it took to create lasting change, but the work was a living entity, ever evolving. One evening, while attending a quiet dinner with old friends who had stood with her from the very beginning, Alexis received a call that would change everything. It was from the mayor of her city, the same mayor who had once publicly dismissed her efforts. His voice, once cold and dismissive, now carried an edge of desperation. "We need your help," he said. The gravity in his tone caught Alexis off guard. The city had seen significant changes, but old wounds were still open, and divisions remained. There were groups now, neither aligned with the movement she had fought for nor with the government, that had begun to rise with violent rhetoric, seeking to undo the progress that had been made. "I thought the battle was over," Alexis said, her voice trembling slightly. "I did too," the mayor admitted, "but the tension is escalating. These groups are organizing, and the fear is that the work you did, the peace we've fought for, could all fall apart." Alexis sat in silence for a long moment, contemplating the weight of his words. She had hoped, over the years, that the fight would naturally shift from survival to stability. But now, it seemed the struggle for justice would always face opposition, no matter the progress made. "We need your voice," the mayor continued. "They listen to you. You've been the bridge we needed to keep the peace. Without you, I'm afraid this city will go back to the way it was." Alexis knew what he was asking. He wasn't just asking for her to return to the front lines of activism. He was asking her to become the peacekeeper, to help guide her city through the darkest hours yet. It was a role she never expected to play, and one that had felt distant for so long. But as she thought about it, she realized that this was the next step in the movement. The challenges now were not just about changing laws, but about changing hearts and minds, about fostering lasting unity even in the face of fear. The next few weeks were a blur. Alexis re-engaged with the local community, meeting with leaders, activists, and even those who had opposed her in the past. She understood the weight of the moment. This was not a moment for victory speeches or public acclaim. It was a time to listen, to heal, and to remind everyone of the humanity they all shared. One of the most difficult meetings was with the leaders of the groups who had risen in opposition. They were angry, frustrated, and deeply distrustful of the progress that had been made. For them, the notion of change was a threat to their own identity and their way of life. When Alexis entered the room, she was met with harsh stares and skeptical eyes. But she had learned how to command a room with nothing more than the calmness of her presence. She didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She just needed to speak the truth. "I know what you're feeling," Alexis began. "I've felt that anger, that frustration. I know what it's like to feel that the world has overlooked you. But this division, it's not the answer. We can create something better, something stronger together." There was a long pause before one of the leaders spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "How do you expect us to believe that? How do you expect us to trust that the peace you've created isn't just another way for people to hold us down?" Alexis's response was simple but heavy with the weight of years spent fighting for justice. "Because I believe in this city. I believe in every single person who calls it home, regardless of where they come from or what they believe. We don't have to agree on everything to stand together. What we have in common, the thing that binds us, is our shared humanity." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Alexis wasn't sure if they had reached the group. But then, slowly, one by one, they began to speak. They shared their fears, their hopes, their doubts. Alexis listened, truly listened, and offered no judgment, only understanding. It wasn't a perfect solution. There was no easy fix to the years of division, the mistrust, the pain. But in that room, something shifted. A bridge was built, a tiny, fragile bridge that would take time to solidify. Alexis knew this was not the end of the fight, but rather the beginning of a new chapter, one that would require patience, empathy, and continued effort. In the weeks that followed, Alexis helped broker meetings between community groups and city leaders. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the conversation stayed open, even when things got tense. And though the path ahead was uncertain, Alexis felt a renewed sense of purpose. The movement for justice had never been just about laws or policies. It was about building a future in which every person could feel seen, heard, and respected. As she sat in her office one afternoon, reviewing documents and preparing for another round of meetings, Alexis received a call from her daughter. "Mom, you won't believe what happened today," her daughter said, her voice filled with excitement. "What happened?" Alexis asked, smiling. "I had a conversation with my teacher about your work," her daughter continued. "And she said that what you did is changing everything. You're teaching us how to make the world better." Tears welled up in Alexis's eyes as she heard the pride in her daughter's voice. For all the sacrifices, the struggles, and the moments of doubt, Alexis knew that it had all been worth it. The work was still ongoing, and there would always be more to do. But in this moment, she knew that the future was in good hands. And as Alexis reflected on everything she had accomplished, she realized that the true power of her journey lay not in the victories or the recognition, but in the lives that were being touched and changed every single day. The movement was alive, and it was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who believed in the possibility of a better world. The last chapter of Alexis's journey unfolded quietly, but with immense impact. She had dedicated her life to the fight for justice. But now, as time passed, she began to see the fruits of her labor in a way she had never imagined. The work she had poured herself into, the hours spent, the sacrifices made, had left a mark that would endure. As the city she had fought so hard for began to find its balance, Alexis found herself stepping back more and more. She had built a foundation that could stand on its own now, but she was still very much part of it, like the roots of a tree deeply entwined with the soil. One evening, as she walked through the park near her home, Alexis saw groups of people gathered, young, old, diverse in every way imaginable. Some were talking, some were organizing, but all were connected by the sense of unity and progress that had been so hard-earned. She stopped to watch them from a distance, smiling softly. She had been the spark that ignited the fire, but now it was a fire that burned with its own strength. There was so much more to do in the world, and so many more battles to fight. But seeing this unity, this progress, filled her with a sense of peace. As she sat on the bench, her thoughts drifted back to that fateful day when she had stood in front of the court, when everything had changed for her. That day was a turning point, not just for her, but for the movement. The man who had tried to silence her had been forced to confront the truth of his own prejudice. And through that, a ripple effect had started, a ripple that had reached farther than she could have ever imagined. Alexis's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back to the present moment. It was a message from an old friend, a fellow activist she had worked with in the early days. "I heard the mayor is considering naming a street after you," the message read. A smile tugged at her lips. It was a gesture she appreciated, but it didn't matter to her. She wasn't in this for recognition. She was in this for the people, for the future, for those who would continue the fight long after she was gone. Her life had become a testament to the power of resilience and unity. She had seen the worst of humanity, and yet had chosen to fight for the best of it. And in doing so, she had helped lay the groundwork for a better world. As the evening turned to night, Alexis stood up from the bench and walked home, her heart full of hope. The work was never truly over, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of closure. She had done all she could, and now she was ready to let the next chapter unfold, knowing that the legacy she had left behind would continue to inspire generations to come. The movement, the fight for justice, it wasn't just her story. It was everyone's story, and it would live on, woven into the fabric of society, forever evolving, forever growing. And in the quiet of that night, Alexis Carter, who had once been a young woman with a dream, felt, at last, that her work had been more than worth it. The world was forever changed because she had believed that change was possible, and the world, in turn, had believed in her. The end of her journey, in many ways, was simply the beginning for those who would continue the fight. The movement would never die. It would always live on, as long as there were people willing to stand up and say, "This is not how it ends."